Welcome to the Beyond the Binder breakout room, everyone.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am privileged to be, that I was asked to moderate this panel of three outstanding and very experienced individuals in our community. I really love the title of this topic, Beyond the Binder, because I think what Mark described is, kind of that initial, less personal, you're given a binder and you're told to come to a meeting, and then you can often sit there for a couple of years trying to figure out what your place is and when you should speak up. And really the objective of Beyond the Binder is how do you get great directors to just hit the ground running and start off being as helpful as you hoped they would be when you brought them onto your board. And so the binder itself, I think of as that's just the very, very beginning of the process. And is it important to have a good binder? Absolutely. It's important for directors to join with as much information as they can possibly have about the history of the organization and what is to be expected and actually how it's governed. But there is a lot that is beyond the binder, and we'll delve into that today. I want to introduce our three panelists that I'm very thrilled to be working with here. First is Amy Connors. She's a principal at Connors and Donahue, and they work with nonprofit organizations primarily in the area of board governance, strategic planning, and fundraising. She's worked with hundreds of organizations. She's really passionate about nonprofit boards and helping to make them more effective. So Amy, thank you for joining us today. Second is Annie Nickman-Plancher, who I have the privilege of serving on the Social Finance Board, which is one of the most strategic and collegial experiences that I've had on a board, and Annie can take a lot of credit for that. She is Vice President of Staff and Strategy and at Social Finance, where she leads their board engagement work. She also spent 6 years at McKinsey, where she helped to launch one of their successful social service initiatives and advised nonprofits on their boards. And third, we have Steve Siegel. He is the Executive in Residence Lecturer at Boston University's Questrom School of Business and the inaugural board chair of an amazing organization, Courageous Parents Network. Steve is an accomplished volunteer, and he's served on more than a dozen for-profit and not-for-profit boards, including Washington University, CJP, Temple Emmanuel, and Hebrew College. It was wonderful for me to be able to serve on the CJP board alongside Steve. So thank you to the three of you for joining us today, and we really look forward to your insights. I thought, just in terms of format, that I was going to begin with one overall question for the group and then a specific one for each panelist. And then I will open it up to everyone else for your questions, either to the group or to a specific person. If you have a question, please type it in the chat or send it to Hannah. And we will be monitoring those questions. So the first question that I would just like to pose to the panel generally is that it's one thing to be brought onto a board, and it's another thing to actually be brought into the real work of the organization. And how do you think about approaching new directors and onboarding them in a way where they can really be brought into the work of the organization right away? So let's see, I'll start with you, Amy.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Just to go right to the negative side, you want to be careful when you talk about bringing a board member into the work of the organization. And Neil talked about this a little before, that you understand the boundaries of what's governance work and what's operational work. And board members can be asked to get involved in operational work as advisors and counselors, and sometimes actually doing the work. And it's hat and when you're wearing an operational hat, and understanding the difference there. So the first thing is to make sure that new directors understand the roles, the boundaries, and what's their job, where they're advisors, where they're strategic, and where they're actually hands-on.
Super. Thank you, Amy. Steve.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I see a lot of people on this call who could replace me. I think Neil hit on this, and you did as well, Lorraine. I think what's important about onboarding is really just the engagement. And so, you know, the best way to do that is one-on-one communication from early on from the executive director or the chair of the board. And I think if you early on have open and direct communication about some of the issues that the organization is facing, or maybe that the executive director is facing personally in terms of coaching or missing skills. Those conversations, if you have recruited the right board member, are going to lead to engagement.
Wonderful. Thank you, Steve. Annie.
Thanks, Lorraine. And sorry if you hear my dog talking to your dog. So it's a great question, and I'll take a little bit of a different tact sort of from the nonprofit perspective. You know, I think the two things that we get, well, there are many things, but two of the things that we're really excited to engage with new board members on, or that we really kind of, the roles that we want them to play, are first as an advisor, and Amy sort of talked about that a little bit, but also as an ambassador for our organization. And so when we think about onboarding, we really want our new board members to kind of deeply understand, I know firsthand, why the work that we're doing is really important. And so we tend to, we have a small board, or mid-size, and so it allows us to actually have a really tailored onboarding process. So of course we have our version of the binder, but we also try to really engage each individual new member in a way that sort of overlaps with their areas of expertise or passion, and are also strategically important to us. So we had a new board member join who was an experienced investment professional, and we had him join the investment committee of one of our new funds. So just an example of something that we really needed advice and guidance on from a board member, and also this new board member was coming in, and that created this opportunity for him to really deeply understand what social finance does. And so that, you know, I think the key there though is to make sure that if you are going to go into that sort of asking for advice on more specific operational topics, that you're really engaging in a way that's both mutually beneficial, where it's really a strategic priority for you, and an area of interest for the new member.
Great. Thank you, Annie. And Annie, I'm going to ask you to continue. You know, as new directors join your board, and as they're brought into challenging conversation, there's this natural tension between openness and transparency, and also the desire to build enthusiasm for the organization. And sometimes board members are brought on at a time when you're immediately thrust into tough conversations. What do you see as common misperceptions that people have about partnering with directors? And how do you think about combating those misperceptions?
Yeah, it's such an important question. And I saw this a lot sort of in advising of nonprofits, and have some, I think the experience at Social Finance has given me a lot of thoughts on how we combat them. I think we do a pretty decent job on that end. So I think there are two interrelated misconceptions that can often create challenges. The first is seeing the board as a client rather than an advisor. And this is really closely related, but the second one is believing that it's important to show the board a positive picture of the organization. So this is sort of what you're talking about, Lorraine, with this transparency. And I see this manifest itself in a few ways. One is, I call it rosiness. So always showing a rosy picture, telling the board about bad news after it's been resolved, sort of taking that approach. The second is what I call buttoning up. So erring on the side of presentation during board meetings rather than really getting into real-time discussion and thinking about strategic questions. And I'll respond to the chat question actually live. When I say seeing the board as a client rather than advisor, I think I have a bit of a consulting frame here, but you know, seeing the board as someone who you are serving the board instead of the board is serving you. And so really sort of treating the board like someone you have to create for and kind of report to, which obviously the board is the, has the governance responsibility over the organization. But I think there's a flip to that, which is really seeing the board as an advisor and a partner that can actually feel a lot more healthy. So I talked about rosiness and buttoning up. And then the third way it manifests is sort of hesitating to overburden the board. So not wanting to, assuming the board members want to engage at a high level and not really roll up their sleeves. And of course, all three of these sort of manifestations create challenges. So obviously, if you're sharing a challenge or bad news too late, you don't actually get the benefit of the problem solving and the expertise of the board. So it's really actually better to share earlier. And also in terms of buttoning up, focusing on the more strategic questions actually, again, helps get the full benefit of the board. And I think from the board member perspective, board members want to contribute where it matters the most rather than just sort of be presented to. I think they want to dig into those meaty questions. And then in terms of hesitating to overburden, I think some board members, I've seen board members who do want to stay high level and want to come to the board meetings and engage at the highest governance level. But I've also seen a lot of board members who want to roll up their sleeves and really dive into the details where they can. So in terms of how we combat these misperceptions, balancing rosiness with realism, I think one way to do this is to just be really transparent from the beginning. So this is partially through the onboarding process. At Social Finance, we talk about our history. So we talk about successes, challenges, failures. We have an annual board retreat where we talk about strategy, and we start every year with here are our strengths and here's what we're not good at. So we're just trying to really be transparent around kind of where our growth areas are. We also just try to keep the board really updated. So sending, regular updates. That way, if there's a problem that's arising, they can kind of catch it in real time. And the idea is to just have the board be a true partner and make sure that when problems do arise, they can kind of jump in with 2 feet rather than be sort of surprised. Second, instead of buttoning up, we like to metaphorically bring out the whiteboard at Social Finance board meetings and really focus on a few areas that we want to engage. So one thing we started doing a couple of years ago after some feedback from the board is that we send out all of our business updates before the board meeting in a pre-read. So the board gets a fairly long compendium of here's how this practice is going, here's how this practice is going. But what that does is it enables us to actually focus the board meeting on 2 or 3 really important strategic discussions where we actually have questions where we're hoping the board will guide us. And then finally, I think I've learned a lot from the CEO of Social Finance, Tracy Palangian. She does not hesitate to meet board members where they are. She understands the unique interests and skill sets of every single board member. And she's able to we are all able, because of her, to engage them in areas that are particularly relevant. We also balance, we have the full board meetings, but she never hesitates to just call Lorraine or just call, Bryce, our board chair, and really engage folks one-on-one. And I think this tailored engagement creates a really good way for us to get feedback and build trust. And again, not feel like we're overburdening the whole board, but kind of meeting people where they are. And then finally, I think this is really tactical, but speaking of feedback, always good to do a board survey. We do an annual assessment. It's just a really helpful way to kind of make sure that you are, from the nonprofit perspective, creating a board environment where the board feels like they're really able to be leveraged, and you feel like you're really creating a positive board environment.
Thank you, Annie. One of the questions I see often that I like to see on board surveys is, do you feel that your expertise as a board member has been utilized? And certainly at Social Finance, I think, I always can check that box wholeheartedly. It's really wonderful. Annie, you mentioned trust. And so Amy, I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about trust. It's so important to build rapport and trust with new directors. It might be slightly harder to do that on a larger board versus a smaller board. What have you seen as some really good tactical approaches for boards to be able to build that level of trust with their directors?
Okay, sure. So, I mean, it goes without saying that you need trust in any good relationship, a board, a marriage, a professional relationship. But it's really hard to kind of figure out how to build that trust. And you needed to have those difficult conversations that Annie was talking about, so that people really feel comfortable exposing their vulnerabilities or kicking around creative ideas. So the challenge is establishing trust early, and so that you can get the new board members productive quickly. That's something that Lorraine spoke about. You don't want them to take years to get up to speed. You want it to be really quickly. So the first thing I think is to understand that the trust is bilateral, that the new directors have to feel that they have enough knowledge and information to add value. So that's part of the orientation. And they need to feel confident that their ideas are really going to be welcome. On the other side, the ED and the current board members need to be open to the new ideas of the board member, and they have to be confident that the new director will maintain confidentiality. So there's a few really tactical things that boards can do to establish this and really have a good foundation so that you can really develop trust. One is to develop really clear channels of communication. Just like at work or your kid's school, you need a defined chain of command. You don't want to go around anybody or go over somebody's head. So as an example, very simple, if you have an issue regarding finances, you go to the finance chair before you go to another board member or the board chair. And it's just understanding whatever clear lines of communication are established. Another good suggestion is to establish board norms. These are the rules of engagement for how board members deal with each other. There are lots of different norms that boards can develop, but a few that have to do with building trust could be maintain confidentiality. A lot gets discussed that shouldn't leave the boardroom, and people need to understand that. The idea that once a decision has been made, the board speaks with one voice is really important in making sure that there's trust and being respectful of differing opinions. So I think having norms like that everybody holds each other accountable for really establish an environment for trust. And this we talked about before, developing that rapport among board members, which is really, really important and that much more difficult now because we don't have the opportunities for those informal interactions before and after meetings. I think Neil was talking about this, but it's really making sure then that we take the time to have the executive director, the board chair, the committee chair, set up a one-on-one Zoom with each new board member, check in with them, make sure they have the tools they need, ask them how they're doing, ask them for their feedback and initial impressions, and start to develop that rapport. And I'll just give you one more in terms of developing rapport is for new board members to assign a board buddy or a board mentor. So that's just somebody who's been on the board who can be an informal reference, just be a friend to the new board member, somebody that they can call after a meeting and say, what were they talking about? I'm not quite sure what's going on here. That person, I think, is really helpful in any situation, and particularly during COVID, where you really have to orchestrate some of those informal relationships that build rapport among board members. So there are a few things for you to consider, and I'm happy to answer questions or keep going.
Thank you, Amy. Those are really, really great suggestions. And I've seen some of those tactics just employed really well, and they just make a huge difference. They've made a huge difference to me being onboarded as a new board member. Now that, Steve, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is just your experience with having the board feel like a team. So you can have individual directors who have been onboarded well, but there's still needs to be an understanding of not just of why they were brought on the board as an individual, but beyond them as individuals, how they can work together as a team. So I wonder if you can speak to that, given your wide experience with so many different kinds of boards.
Well, I think a lot of that is, going to overlap with some of the things that Annie and Amy were already talking about. I think the key is to have everyone on the same page. In not in terms of the response to a question, but you want to make sure that the board is asked the question before adding new members. Why are we getting this new member? So that obviously, if they ask the question, why are you coming to me? You can answer that question easily. And to me, the first question is this person interested in engaging in the mission of the organization? Have they demonstrated that either because they're involved with other organizations? Have they been a donor already? So that's step one. I think step two is recognizing that this isn't the board is not sort of a Yelp session or a user committee. So that you're not just looking for kind of feedback or complaints or criticisms. You're really trying to recruit allies of the executive director or the organization. So I think if you are targeting people who you have confidence that are engaging in the mission, and that are not just there to sort of provide feedback on services or more mundane things, but they're actually there to help the organization get better and to achieve the mission, you're more likely to be working as a team, particularly if you've implemented some of the things that Annie and Amy have already talked about, or that Lorraine, you and Neil had already talked about. And I think if you are recruiting board members and the board or the chair or the executive director have thought about the needs of the organization. So what issues is the board or is the organization facing, and what resources would be helpful? Is the board facing some kind of a strategic planning issue, or are there financial issues? Is there, what skill or resource is missing? And in that way, the way you talked about going to find a scientist, you're recruiting somebody who feels like, okay, I'm here for a reason, and I want to help everybody else advance the organization, and I want to help everybody else support the executive director. So now this doesn't mean that the board should be filled with, just yes people. But it does mean that the questions and the responses and the help provided are really being provided to, again, advance the mission or help the executive director in cases where the executive director may be weak in a certain skill. If the executive director, for example, has no financial experience or struggles with reading financial statements, then maybe you have a very strong and supportive chair of a finance committee or person on the board who acts as a treasurer, things like that.
Thank you, Steve. Really helpful. I love thinking about the board and board members that you bring on as augmenting skills that the organization may not yet have. So just a great suggestion. One interesting question came in ahead of time, which is just setting expectations for board members. What are reasonable expectations to set, and when should you set those expectations? Either around the time that they're going to need to be spending, or around fundraising and giving expectations, or just general sharing of skills. I'll open it up to anyone to pick up on that, but how do you think about setting those expectations, and when is the right time to set those expectations?
So can I take a stab at that one? So it's important to set expectations. It's important to be transparent and clear and open and honest with the expectations and thorough. And really the right time to do it is while you're recruiting the person, so that they understand coming in what the expectations are, whether they're for their financial contribution or the amount of time that's required, how many committees they're expected to be on, you know, what the homework looks like before board meetings. You know, all of those things are really important to clarify when you're recruiting the person. And it's important to have them written down, because if somebody isn't living up to those expectations, you need to have them agreed to and written down so that you can have a difficult conversation with somebody to say, how come you're not fulfilling the expectations? So having that written job description of a board member and expectations is really fundamental for a board.
Yeah, I agree completely. Annie, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to add, I completely agree. And I would add that it's also important to sort of revisit those kind of on an ongoing basis. And so being really clear up front, but then also I'm thinking about our board survey, and we actually have kind of one-on-one conversations with folks just to understand sort of, is this too much time? Is it the right amount of time? So it's sort of like setting those expectations up front, but then also revisiting. So, you know, doing a pulse check. How many committees is every person on? Let's just be really transparent about that and ask people what committees they want to be on. And so I think there's sort of the just the ongoing check back as well, which can be helpful.
Great. One question has come in just about board orientation in terms of who should do it, how much is too much. And, you know, maybe one of you can speak to some of the, like a really good board orientation process that you've seen, and why you think it was such a good one or a bad one. I suppose we could look at both sides of the coin. Who wants to take that one? Steve?
Sure. I think I've been on 2 good ones and a few that didn't exist at all. So this, I think, depends a lot on the size of the organization. And for a lot of the things that I think we've been talking about, and somebody already mentioned this, maybe Amy already mentioned this, you know, as the organization grows, typically the size of the board is going to grow, and you have to be much more mindful about all these things. So a good orientation would mean you'd have the full binder, but you know, the binder isn't a live person. Obviously, it's a document that, you know, can take a while to get through, and reading things you might miss a few things, and you obviously don't have any kind of personal connection through just reading the binder. And so the best board orientations I've had is where we've had you know, a full meeting that can last anywhere from an hour to 3 hours or even longer, where the executive director typically, or the chair, is doing that orientation. And again, if the board is large enough, and you have annual turnover, you might have, you know, 3 to 5 or half a dozen people participating in that orientation. But even if it's a small board, you'd have to do that one-on-one. And again, I think what you're trying to do is go over all the things that are important to the organization in terms of, okay, what's the mission? What, again, Annie, I think mentioned this, what are we good at? What are we struggling with? And again, it should be a very, you know, I was asking somebody the other day, well, is there a point where where you're trying to balance transparency with, you know, holding things back? And thankfully the answer was no. You should be totally transparent all the time with board members. Now, maybe if they haven't accepted being a board member yet, there may be some things that you don't want to disclose, because there may be open issues that you don't want the public aware of yet, if you haven't kind of figured out what your public communication plan is. But generally, you know, transparency and an in-person orientation around, okay, what's the mission? Where do we need help? What are we good at? And what are the issues that we're facing?
Great. Thank you, Steve. The time period for orientation is interesting. I thought it might pose that to everyone. Amy, you mentioned the concept of a board buddy, which is someone who can sort of be a thought partner and therefore a board member, which is implying to me that orientation is not a day or even a week. And so how do you think about this time period of orientation and how that transitions into engagement? Do you want to, can you start with that?
Yeah, I'll start with that. So I think just building on what Stephen just said is there are different parts of it. There's the piece where you're learning about the organization and the program. There's the piece where you're learning about being a board member. And then there's the getting engaged, which again, in times other than COVID, it would be, actually spending a day looking at the operations of the organization, whether it's a social service agency or an arts agency, whatever it is, actually being there and seeing the program in action and spending time with the executive director and building a relationship there is part of the orientation. And as you said, it goes on. You mentioned earlier, can be a few years, but really I think orientation for a new board member is a full year. I find that it takes board members a full year of the full board cycle to really feel like they have their legs under them and can really contribute at a really high level. I mean, you want them to participate quickly, but so for that full year, you need to be checking in with that person, giving them chances to ask questions, provide feedback. And I think that primarily falls to the board chair to keep checking in with the new people. And I think through the first year is really the time frame that it takes to kind of get your legs under you.
I just want to jump in and tell a short story that Amy just kind of reminded me of. And this relates to, there's this overlap between, expectations, orientation, and engagement. And that changes over time. And so my personal story is when Brad Bloom recruited me to the board of CJP, I asked him a question. I said, well, I just don't want to be responsible for raising money. And again, I want to know what the expectations are for board involvement. I'm happy to provide insights and advice and be a donor, but I don't want to raise money. And he said, oh yeah, that's no problem. You don't have to do that. I think a year or two later, I was co-chair of the campaign. So I went from, not raising, having this expectation of not raising money to being the fundraising person. So the only reason I tell that story is that to support what Amy is saying about, setting the expectations, but people's interest in the organization can develop over time if that person is engaged by the right people on the board or the executive director.
Great. Thank you, Steve. I love the concept of engagement not being a one-time thing or having to be really thoughtful about director engagement over a longer period of time. Annie, I see you nodding, so I'm sure you want to add to that part of the conversation.
Yeah, it's funny. I was actually thinking of a personal story here as well. I joined a board about a year and a half ago, and I remember feeling like I couldn't add any. It's a big board, like 100 people style board, an arts organization. And after a year during COVID, at the beginning of COVID, the executive director asked me to be on a task force to help them think about how to innovate in this time of COVID and still deliver their art in this moment. And that was actually the turning point for me, was being engaged in that really specific way, which I would never have thought about being engaged in when I joined the board a year and a half ago. And now I feel much more connected to the board. I know the other board members on that task force. I just feel much more engaged. And so I think I was nodding because I was just thinking about that, like onboarding can take a very long time, and learning how to really individually pull people in and get them to really roll up their sleeves can really happen through these kind of more tailored engagements.
Thank you, Annie. It's such an interesting story. And Kimberly's posed this question about how to successfully engage board members during the time of COVID, but you've kind of reframed it as COVID can be an opportunity to actually deeply engage people in a very different way. So I don't know if we only have a couple minutes left, but did any of the panelists want to speak to specific ways that they've seen that they've been successfully engaged during this time of COVID, or that they've seen boards successfully engage their directors during the time of COVID?
I'll build on what Annie just said about getting people involved in a task force or a committee. I mean, I think sometimes boards say, oh, we'll give the new person a little bit of space before we assign them to a committee. And I really think that's a terrible mistake, because even not in times of COVID, when you're new on the board, you're excited, you have energy, and you really want to take advantage of that energy. They're never going to be more excited and ready to dig in and get going. So I would assign your new people to a task force or a committee, or give them, as Annie said, a very specific task right away and take advantage of that. And I think in COVID, it's making sure those committees actually are meeting and that they're doing Zoom meetings, because working in smaller groups, committee size, 4, 6, 8, 10 people, those are workable groups in a Zoom meeting, where 20, 30, 40, 50 really isn't. So it's giving them a chance to be in a smaller group, build relationships, and be able to contribute in the work of the board.
Thank you, Amy. I would agree. In an odd way, Zoom, like with a small group, can almost be more intimate. I find when I'm sitting in a boardroom, I don't see the people on my side of the table. And so, sort of seeing, as we're seeing today, all your lovely faces, there is an intimacy to it that you can possibly take advantage of. I know that we are out of time. Is that right, Dara? So I just want to take a moment and really, first of all, thank all of you for participating. It's really amazing to see so many people that are really committed to improving the board performance in their organizations. And I think that the boards are really the foundation for all of the work that will get done. And a huge thank you to our panelists. I've learned so much from all of you and from each of you, and have had the joy of working with you, and just really appreciate the wisdom and insights that you've shared today. And just want to also thank Kimberly, Dara, and Marnie and CJP for bringing forth this concept that we all have knowledge that we can share with one another, and that we're a stronger community in the Boston area and beyond if we are willing to share our expertise with everyone. So thank you very much. See you in the main session.
Thank you.